There are, I think, three underexplored lessons in the leadership of Margaret Thatcher, in spite of the mountain of books that have already been written about her and many, many more to come. And they are these. First of all, the importance of being a teacher as a leader, explaining at each point what you're doing accessibly and to the widest possible audience. Second, the ability to recognise the space you've got on the political stage to either act radically or cautiously. And third, the need to follow through the consequences of policies that might on the surface appear a success and are popular, but lead to darker consequences if those consequences aren't addressed. I'm going to look at all three. There's a fourth, actually, and this is a common theme with all our leaders and prime ministers. And that is that the seeds of your success are often, too, the seeds of your downfall. It was very precisely the case with Margaret Thatcher, because her astonishing ascent to the top of the Conservative Party happened, at least in its final phase, because of the portfolio she was given, ironically by Ted Heath, after the 1974 February election, when the Conservatives were defeated. He gave Margaret Thatcher, who had been his assiduous, loyal Education Secretary — she irritated him, but no more than that at that point in their relationship — she gave Margaret Thatcher the post of Environment Spokeswoman, Shadow Environment Secretary, a seemingly dry post in the aftermath of one of the great dramatic elections of recent times. But it was the post that gave Margaret Thatcher the opportunity to become almost the great populist Tory politician. What happened was this: when she got the post, she started working on a policy which she actually privately had some doubts about, which was the abolition of the rate system, the local property system by which local authorities raised some of their revenue. The rates were going up. Like most taxes, it was an unpopular tax, and she began working with characteristically long hours on ways to abolish it. And in August 1974, when most Conservative politicians were exhausted and on holiday after that traumatic period in power and the lost election, she, again characteristically, was not on holiday. She held a press conference as Shadow Environment Spokeswoman, proposing that the next Conservative government would abolish the rates, this property tax, this unpopular property tax. A few weeks later, Harold Wilson, the Prime Minister, called a second election in October 1974. And she was the Conservative star of the election. In a dark campaign where politicians were battling it out over who could be least unpopular, there she was, self-confidently saying, "I can do something that a lot of you would like." Polls suggested the policy was popular, that she would be better, more prominent. She was given an entire party election broadcast. And suddenly, this Education Secretary of some prominence became one of the great Tory media stars in that election campaign. And then, inadvertently, Ted Heath did her another favour. After that election, which they lost again, he put Margaret Thatcher in the Treasury team. And she, growing in confidence as a public performer, more than held her own in the House of Commons against the formidable Labour Chancellor, Denis Healey. She was doing all that as Conservative MPs were beginning to decide they'd had enough of Heath. who had just lost 2 elections in a year. At the time, famously, they wondered whether the right-wing candidate in any leadership contest would be Sir Keith Joseph, and Margaret Thatcher adored Sir Keith Joseph. She assumed he would be the right-wing candidate. He, during the latter part of 1974, Keith Joseph, imploded with a series of controversial speeches, which meant he was never, ever going to be leader of the party. It was her prominence, provided by Ted Heath, that attracted Tory MPs towards her. She would be the right-wing candidate, even though she hadn't displayed a great deal of ideological verve up until this point. She had been utterly loyal to Heath as he battled with the unions, as he conducted various policy U-turns. She just got on with her job at education. But a combination of that prominence, including that policy to abolish the rates, which she never forgot, meant that she became the alternative to Heath in the leadership contest they held in February 75. And she always regarded it from that moment on as her mission, when it became possible, to abolish the rates and replace it with an alternative tax. The desire to do so was to bring about her downfall. But when she won that leadership in February 75, to Heath's fury, he never ever forgave her, he loathed her from that moment on, she displayed another important skill of leadership, which is to recognise the amount of space you've got to do what you yourself would like to do. She didn't have very much, and she knew it. Her genius, in a way, was to also recognise when she had more space, as we'll go on to explore. But at the beginning, she appointed to senior posts most of Heath's allies. Willie Whitelaw, who stood against her in the final round of the leadership, was made her deputy, and it became an important relationship. Those who she was later to dismiss as wets, Jim Pryor, Peter Walker, people like that, Ian Gilmore, were all in senior positions in that shadow cabinet. She was always instinctively cautious until the space opened up. When she won in 1979, she clearly wanted to take on the miners at some point, to purge the memories of the nightmares of the Heath government. She wanted to do a whole range of things. At first, she did not think she had the space to do it. She wasn't strong enough in the Conservative Party. She wasn't arguably strong enough in the country to push the boundaries too far. So, for example, when it looked as if there would be a clash with the miners early in her first term in power, when she was deeply unpopular in the polls, she gave in. She didn't think she was strong enough to win. She was cautious on public sector pay. She tended to give the awards that were due without any challenge, even though she wanted to constrain public spending. But when she sensed space on the political stage was opening up, she moved with the speed of light. Now, there's a bit of a myth about when this happened. The myth is this, that it was after the victory in the Falklands during her first term in power that she became almost invincible. That's not what gave her the political space on the stage. It undoubtedly changed her as a public performer. She became more regal, self-confident and strident. She kept on referring to Winston Churchill as Winston, implying that the two of them were the great war leaders of our times. And unquestionably, she saw herself, as much of the media did, as a formidable, courageous leader. And there is a myth that that propelled her to victory in the following election. Here is what happened with the Falklands. She had no choice but to go to war. The only alternative to that would have been her resignation. When the Falkland Islands were invaded in March 1982 by the Argentinian junta, the House of Commons met on the Saturday. And at that extraordinary historic gathering, Even the Labour leader Michael Foot, a unilateralist when it came to nuclear weapons, called for a military response. One of the MPs she admired most emphatically, Enoch Powell, said she would have to go if there was no military response. So it's quite wrong to look at Margaret Thatcher's decision to take on the Argentinian junta and go to war as an act of bravery. It's the wrong prism. She had no choice but to do so. And victory, though never certain, was always pretty likely. That wasn't what gave her the political space. It was the split in the Labour Party. The formal schism in the Labour Party, which began kind of in 1980 when Michael Foot was elected leader, and formalised in 1981 with the creation of the SDP, meant one thing for sure, that only the Conservative Party could win the next election. If you have a left alternative split into two, they cancel each other out. There was a brief phase during the SDP's honeymoon when it looked as if they might kind of sweep the country. Such was the excitement, especially in the media, of these charismatic former Labour figures. But they were never going to defeat Labour in parts of the north of England. Never. So it meant that Margaret Thatcher had the good fortune, and she was a lucky leader on many fronts, but she had the good fortune to face a split opposition. And that's what allowed her to become more radical. And to give her credit, she recognised it. There are some leaders who don't recognise the space they have. Tony Blair in 1997 winning a landslide didn't quite realise the amount of space he had on the stage. When Labour split, a letter appeared in The Guardian. It was a very short letter from a prophetic reader which just said this: Shirley Williams has left the Labour Party. The Labour Party will be out of power for decades. And that was right. And one of the others who got it was Margaret Thatcher. It was in 1981, when this split happened, that she started to make her moves. She purged her cabinet of her despised wets. She sacked some of them. And she moved Jim Pryor, one of the wets, to Northern Ireland, which is in some ways a more severe punishment. She brought in Norman Tebbit and other like-minded allies and started to become more radical because she knew she could win. Similarly, in the second term, having won a landslide, you began to see the development of more daring policies because she knew she had the space to do it. There was no internal opposition by then. She had purged her cabinet of these wets and severe critics, and she made her moves. So until the end, when she lost this judgment, this was one of the important lessons, I think. The political stage in UK politics is very cluttered and crowded, but she knew when she had a bit more space than most prime ministers do, and when she had less. The next lesson is that we have become too obsessed, I think, with spin and spin doctors. Thatcher was her own spin doctor. She was an instinctive communicator. You could agree or disagree with what she was saying, and many of her messages were banal or economically nonsensical. But they sort of made sense of complicated, dry policies. And she did it without an Alistair Campbell figure or a Peter Mandelson. She did it almost instinctively. She said, for example, in the late 70s, in trying to explain her growing support for monetarism, that her dad, who owned a grocer's shop in Grantham, never spent more than he earned, and a country should never spend more than it earned. It was absolute economic illiteracy because the state is very different from a grocer's shop, but it was powerful. It was easy to understand, and it appeared to make sense of what might have appeared quite draconian, radical economic policies. And while she was doing this, she was building up an important and at that point constructive relationship with her Shadow Chancellor Geoffrey Howe, who had his first budget written before he got into the Treasury in 1979. And throughout her period, she was able constantly to make sense of, on one level, her policies, however complex. We're giving industries to the people with privatisation. Always trying to make sense. Tony Benn, who was her equivalent in the Labour Party from the left, recognised quite regularly in his diaries that she was a teacher. And although they disagreed with each other profoundly, he saw this as one of her great strengths. The third lesson about Margaret Thatcher's leadership, I think, is this. And this is based not just on criticisms from those on the left, it's also based on the memoirs of her cabinet colleagues as they reflected on some of the mistakes that were made. As she pursued radical policies with apparent success, the consequences were largely overlooked. The hard bit. You have the glamour of introducing a policy and then you turn away. Here are three examples. The sale of council houses, which was in her 1979 manifesto, was a policy that transformed not only housing in Britain but electoral politics. It made suddenly some tenants house owners, and they became owners at a point where property was booming in parts of the UK. Some of them became quite well off as a result. They sold their council houses and voted for her very gratefully. She was famously photographed visiting grateful tenants, having cups of tea with them. But she didn't do the follow-through. After the council houses were sold off, there was no attempt to rebuild affordable housing on anything like the scale required. And as a result, there has been a housing crisis ever since. And that's had all kinds of implications, including soaring housing benefit bills as the state pays for people who can't get rented accommodation in the public sector to go to expensive private accommodation. It should have been accompanied, that policy which Labour later adopted and accepted they were wrong to have opposed, with a massive house building programme. But there was no follow-through. And this happened in several other areas. The miners' strike, where she defeated the miners, which she provocatively called in an overexcited way the enemy within. There was a case that she put and indeed commanded quite a lot of support for. But as several cabinet ministers have said since, there was no, from that era, there was no attempt to rebuild those communities who had been dependent on mining. There should have been a follow-through when all those jobs were lost, and there wasn't. She moved on to other areas. And so it was with the radical economic policies, many of them regarded as successful. The Big Bang, the light regulatory touch on the city, meant that although it produced great wealth for individuals and to some extent in terms of revenue for the government, it meant quite literally there was no control any longer. Government ceased to frame an intensive regulatory system, and arguably the seeds were sown then for the financial crash that followed in 2008. For someone who could immerse herself in policy detail, there tended not to be policy follow-through. And then, of course, her premiership was dominated by the end with a single issue, Europe. In a way, as she transformed her party into one with a much more radical cutting edge. Remember, the Conservative Party was this pragmatic election-winning machine. It became much more Thatcherite. She personified a change in her own party. She also moved it, as she moved, towards a more Eurosceptic position. And she became, in the end, the first prime ministerial victim of that move. She became increasingly hostile to Europe in tone, but rarely in practice. It was she who was a great advocate of the Single European Act and the market that took place, from which only more recently the UK contemplates leaving. It was she that signed up to every single treaty during her period as Prime Minister. But tonally, she was becoming more and more hostile. And yet, to her credit, actually, and all the cabinet ministers say this is true, she was happy enough to have senior cabinet ministers who were in a very different position. If you look at her senior ministers, the people she promoted, they tended to be people like Ken Clarke, Douglas Hurd, and of course Geoffrey Howe. She didn't like him. She moved him from the Treasury, but she gave him the Foreign Office. He was more, at that point, pro-European than she was. And these cabinet ministers were growing increasingly alarmed by her tendency to be shrill at European Union gatherings and to display in the House of Commons a level of intolerance where famously, just before Sir Geoffrey Howe made his famous resignation speech, she screamed, "No, no, no," at various propositions that had emerged from a European Union summit. She was the first, but by no means the last, Conservative Prime Minister to fall partly over Europe. And ironically, at that point, it was because the pro-European wing of her cabinet felt strongly enough in the end to say, we've had enough of her. We can't carry on like this. But that's not what brought her down. It was the policy that made her in the first place that brought her down. Always at the back of her mind, she remembered that election in October 1974 when she became a TV star, pledging to scrap the rates, that local tax system. And in her final term, as it turned out, she went into the election pledged to scrapping the rates. She thought it would be incredibly popular. And she did so because at that point there was going to be a property revaluation and rates were going to go up big time, both in Scotland and the rest of the UK. But she made the huge mistake, and this was a sign that she was losing big time the skills she had to judge how far she could go. She made the mistake of proposing a flat rate tax. The poll tax, as it became, the community charge, as she insisted on calling it. This was the policy that ultimately brought her down. It became unpopular in Scotland to the point that only in recent times have the Conservatives started to recover. She mistakenly introduced it in Scotland first, a year early, which was seen as an unforgivable act of provocation in the from the Conservative government at Westminster in Scotland. Arguably, the move towards the SNP began then. It certainly explains the decline of the Conservative Party in Scotland. But when she introduced it in England, it proved to be unpopular not only in Labour areas but in Conservative areas too. And Conservative leaders at local government conferences were up in arms. Chris Patten was the Environment Secretary at the time, and he used to take the projected poll tax bills to Margaret Thatcher. They were huge in some cases. And he once said to me, actually, Chris Patten, I show Margaret Hilda. He always called her Margaret Hilda, implying she was a slightly eccentric aunt by this time. I show Margaret Hilda these poll tax projected levels, and she looks up to me and says, Chris, I don't believe you. And she was so convinced that this would be ultimately popular and necessary as a means of holding councils to account and making them more efficient, she wouldn't listen. By the end, she listened big time. She wasn't that daft, although she was, I think, losing a lot of her political antennae. And in a frantic last-minute bid to hold on to power, she offered a whole series of revisions of the poll tax, excluding large numbers of groups, putting poll tax caps on the amount that local authorities could charge in a way that totally undermined the principle of the proposal in the first place. It showed that she was, in the end, still willing to compromise to hold on to power. But it was too late. And it was a time when it was the parliamentary party alone that determined who would be leader, and they got rid of her in the most dramatic internal act of execution, political execution in modern times. She never got over it, what she called the, specifically the attacks on her from her own cabinet, who one by one told her in November 1990 that she had to go. And her fall traumatised the Conservative Party for decades to follow. That, I think, is the final lesson of leadership from Margaret Thatcher. There are some times when parties become trapped. They need to remove a leader to have a hope of winning an election, but in doing so, they are inevitably traumatised for a long time to come. The key figures in the removal of Margaret Thatcher, figures like Michael Heseltine, were never fully trusted again by the membership. Heseltine stood in the subsequent leadership contest of MPs and didn't win. That was partly because members were telling MPs, you can't have him, he was the one who wielded the knife. But more than that, the Conservative Party lost some sense of what it was. Had they turned against her because they were no longer Thatcherite? Had they turned against her because they were Thatcherite, but that she had lost the ability to lead? Had they turned against her because they thought that not only were they no longer Thatcherite and that she had lost the ability to lead, but they wanted to move towards some kind of position on the centre ground? And it meant that whoever succeeded her was going to find the inheritance impossible. She herself had been tormented in the early years of her leadership by her predecessor, Ted Heath, who behaved badly. He never got over the fact that she replaced him, and he disagreed fundamentally with a lot of the things that she then did. And boy, did he make it absolutely clear that he did. She did the same with her successor. John Major became her successor. It was her chosen successor. She wanted it to be John Major, but she began to orchestrate revolts against his leadership and to give interviews suggesting he wasn't up to the job. It was another sign that she had lost that early ability to know when the political stage is crowding in on you and you need to be very careful what you say and do. When you lose, the best thing to do is to say thank you very much, write your memoirs, and keep out of what follows next in your party. She couldn't do that, which was probably a sign that those MPs who wielded the knives were right to do so. But she never came to terms with it for the rest of her life.